from a cold and snowy Bloomington. I hope you are inside wherever you are, and if you're not, I hope you are well dressed. My name's Carl Pearson. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of the Middle East at Indiana University. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our panel on Israel in the Middle East after Trump. Our panelists today include Professor Dina Spechler, who is in the political science department at Indiana University, and she's taught previously at Hebrew U and Tel Aviv University, and has, as latest count, I think 4 books on Russia and the Soviet Union. In addition, we have Professor Pierre Atlas, political science professor at Marian University, where it is also snowing, apparently. And he is, in addition to the professor there, you may have seen his words in the Indianapolis Business Journal, where he is a columnist. And finally, the founding director of the Center for the Study of the Middle East, Ambassador Feisal Istrabadi, who also teaches in the law school here at IU, as well as this semester in Central Eurasian Studies and in the International Studies Department. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Feisal to say a few words before we begin.
Thank you very much, Carl. This is, I'm not going to take very long initially. I mean, I'll speak later as a member of the panel after my 2 colleagues have done so. But I thought it appropriate to take a moment to say a word about my late sister, who died on the 23rd of January. Dr. Istrabadi was for nearly 20 years a lecturer and senior lecturer at the Department of what was then Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. Now it's Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures. She was the first hire in the department after an effort to rebuild the department was made by the then chair of the department, Professor Nazif Shahrani. And as I said, she taught there for 20 years. She is also one of the reasons I thought it was appropriate for me now is one of the founders, really, of the Center for the Study of the Middle East after we were disassociated by the then Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. And she was a part of a committee which I chaired to reestablish Middle East studies into what became the Center for the Study of the Middle East, and then was an indispensable, always an indispensable member of the team that wrote the 3 Title VI grant applications, which fund the center and have done so since its founding, which were the first time that Indiana University had a fully funded Title VI center in Middle Eastern studies. She particularly loved her students, and if I may say, was beloved by them. And she won a number of teaching awards, including most recently in 2019, the Trustees Teaching Award. And I must say, and a reason I wanted to say something is that I have received literally hundreds upon hundreds of messages and texts and letters and notes and so on. And I am methodically responding to each of them. So if you've not heard from me yet, it's because I'm working my way through all of that. But I'm very grateful to each and every one of them. As I said, I will respond as I'm responding every day in due course. We will plan when we are able to get together to have a memorial when we are able, in fact, to convene in person. So please stand by for that information. I just thought we ought to take a moment. And with that, let me turn things over to my dear colleague, Professor Dina Spechler. Thank you.
Feisal, and I want to add just a word. I only found out just now about the death of your sister, and she was an extraordinarily beloved presence. I know her indirectly through, or knew her through all the wonderful comments I heard about her from my students all the time. And I know it's a terrible loss, and you do have my heartfelt sympathy. Well, I thought I would talk today about three things. I'm going to focus specifically on uh, Israel and the Middle East after Trump. I thought I'd begin with a brief overview of Trump's policies toward the Middle East and particularly toward Israel, and then talk about what has already and is likely to change under President Biden. And insofar as time allows, at the end, I will talk a little bit about um, uh, what we can expect from Israel in the new environment within which Israel will be operating and going forward. So I think it's completely well known to all of you and no surprise to hear that the most important thing to say really about the Trump administration and the Middle East, I think, is that the Middle East was extremely high priority for Mr. Trump. He came to office with a vision of what he wanted to accomplish in the Middle East, at least in vague terms, and it was extremely important to him to do that. And I think it's also well known that his policies were characterized by very close ties to Israel, strong support for Israeli positions on most issues, and even considerable policy coordination with Israel. He had a very close personal relationship with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And he engaged in many actions that were very much welcomed by Israel, including, I would say, initiatives that Netanyahu personally had long sought. Just to rehearse a few of these that came to my mind, they began with President Trump's withdrawal from the so-called Iran deal, the JCPOA, something that Israel had hoped for. Moved on to recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, transferring the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and closing the US consulate in East Jerusalem, which had been the locus of relations with interactions with Palestinians. He went on to recognize the Golan as part of Israel by presidential proclamation to end both indirect and direct support for aid to the Palestinians. He closed the PLO office in Washington, D.C. Through his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, he declared that Jewish settlements in the West Bank are consistent with international law and not an obstacle to peace. He then, of course, as I think you all know, announced a plan for peace between Israelis and Palestinians that could be characterized in many ways. One way is to say that it relied on bridges and tunnels to unite otherwise unconnected portions of a future Palestinian state, and allowed for the extension of Israeli sovereignty to all Jewish settlements in the West Bank, as well as to the Jordan Valley. And kind of the last set of actions that he took, very important to Israel, was his facilitation of normalization accords between Israel and 4 Arab states, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. So what's likely to change under Biden? I think the first thing to say is that except for one key issue, a very important exception, and that is the so-called Iran deal or the JCPOA, the Middle East is likely to be much lower priority for the Biden administration, at least for some time. Mr. Biden wants to address 2 enormous domestic and global crises before he turns his attention to other things. Those are, of course, the pandemic and economic recovery from the impact of the pandemic. President Biden has a very long agenda of pressing domestic issues to which it would seem that he attaches greater priority than to foreign affairs generally. So racial justice, immigration policy, gun control, raising the federal minimum wage, investment in green energy, expansion of healthcare, student loan debt forgiveness, tuition-free colleges, universal access to preschool, and of course, eliminating some of President Trump's tax cuts to pay for all of this. Insofar as President Biden does assign high priority to foreign policy issues, except for the JCPOA, the Middle East does not seem to be at the top of his list. Higher priority items include expansion of trade with several different partners, repairing the NATO alliance, dealing with Russia and China on arms control, security, and human rights issues, moving forward on global measures to halt climate change, and coordinating with the World Health Organization to prevent and handle almost inevitable future global health crises. Now, as this list suggests, it would be quite wrong to say that Biden has no background in dealing with foreign policy issues. He was a ranking member and then chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee starting in 1997. He also had a substantial foreign policy portfolio as vice president. And in all of these capacities, he devoted a great deal of attention to the Middle East, visiting there on quite a few occasions. He knows the region quite well. And perhaps for that reason, he comes to the presidency with very low expectations for what his administration can accomplish in the Middle East. And I would say this is especially true with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. President Biden is well aware that this relationship is at its lowest point since the Second Intifada in the early 2000s. And he's not convinced that American actions are going to do much to improve the situation. He doesn't come to office determined, as Trump was, to reverse or undo all the policies of his predecessor, but neither is he committed to sustaining those policies. We also need to remember that President Biden is not the only important individual with influence on foreign policy in his administration. He has appointed a Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and a National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, in whom he appears to have great confidence. And they're likely to have more time to deal with issues relating to the Middle East. They're certainly not likely to ignore the Middle East, especially given Biden's eagerness to restore the JCPOA, the Iran deal. So in the statements of these two officials, Blinken and Sullivan, as well as by Mr. Biden himself, we've already seen the emergence of notable policy differences with Israel that did not exist during the Trump presidency. And of course, the most important of these does relate to the JCPOA. President Biden believes the US should rejoin the deal. He is convinced that the United States, Israel, and the world are better off with Iran and the US in it. And he and his advisors have announced this position very clearly. Now, the Israeli government, as I think most of you know, deeply opposes any move by the US to rejoin the Iran deal. Israel's position is that the only way to induce Iran to abandon its nuclear weapons program is to maintain the sanctions that the Trump administration imposed on it. And Israel is convinced that the Iranians have found and would find ways to continue a nuclear weapons program were the deal to be revived, at least in its previous form. Israel believes that lifting the sanctions Trump imposed on Iran would greatly enhance Iran's efforts in the nuclear realm. And lifting them would also provide the financial wherewithal to enable Iran to pursue its medium-range missile program, expanding the number, the accuracy, the destructiveness, and the speed of weapons that it could use to wreak terrible destruction on Israel. And reducing or eliminating the sanctions would also enhance Iran's ability to finance Hezbollah and Hamas and supply both of them with increasingly sophisticated and devastating weapons, likewise capable of doing enormous harm to Israel. President Biden and his advisors are definitely concerned about these issues that Israel has raised, and they intend to try to make headway on them in discussions with Iran, but they don't want them to stand in the way of restoring the deal. From what we know publicly, Jake Sullivan has already had at least 5 hours of intensive talks with the Israelis on this matter, But as far as we know publicly, at any rate, it doesn't appear that there's been any agreement at all on how to proceed. The US is probably going to seek ways to help Israel bolster its security in the aftermath of a resumption of a deal or the deal. But it's not going to be governed by Israel's views of this matter with regard to the JCPOA. On another issue, whether the United States will do as much under Biden as it did under Trump to foster the normalization process with other Arab states remains to be seen. Israel has been greatly hoping for that. Very important agenda item for Israel. But there may well be a subtle US policy shift, hardly a policy clash, but possibly a shift in that area. Such a change would be more a reflection of revised US priorities than of any real disagreement with Israel. In fact, a Biden administration official has praised those accords, but helping to arrange more of them may not be as high on the Biden agenda as it was on the Trump agenda. A more serious area of real disagreement between Israel and the US that's already emerged relates to the status of the Golan Heights. I would say that there is no piece of land anywhere on its borders that Israel regards as more vital to its security. Given Syria's record of using the Golan to threaten population centers and stage attacks on Israel, I can say with a lot of certainty that no Israeli leader is ever going to be willing to give it back. However, in a recent interview on CNN, Secretary Blinken refused to endorse the Trump administration's declaration that Golan is part of Israel. He acknowledged that as long as Assad is in power in Syria and Iran is present in Syria, as our militia groups backed by Iran, as he put it, control of the Golan is very important to Israel's security. However, Blinken said, legal questions are something else. Over time, if the situation were to change in Syria, that's something we would look at. Now, this disagreement, I think, is unlikely to lead to a policy clash between Israel and the US because it's hard to imagine a radical change in the situation in Syria anytime soon. But, you know, I won't say for the distant future that that couldn't happen. Stronger disagreements with the US might emerge indeed on the issue of relations with the Palestinians. Richard Mills, currently the acting US ambassador to the UN, announced last month that the US will restore contacts with Palestinian leaders and resume economic and humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. President Biden has said that he plans to open the Palestinian mission in Washington and the US consulate in Jerusalem, or I should say, reopen them. And I think Israel is going to regard these policies as tolerable. It did so for many years. But what Israel would deeply oppose would be resumption of American support for the United Nations Relief and Works Administration, UNRWA. As Israel sees it, that agency has consistently funded production and distribution of educational materials that call for its elimination. And in Israel's view, this has only inflamed anti-Israel passions, and that therefore UNRWA is aggravating the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and making it much harder to resolve. Thus far, I should say, as far as I know, the Biden administration has not announced a policy toward UNRWA. Other than on the Iran deal, the sharpest clash between Israel and the US appears to likely to be over the question of settlements on the West Bank or annexation of portions of it. During his confirmation hearing, Secretary Blinken echoed the president's sentiments, saying that realistically, it's hard to see near-term prospects for moving forward on the peace process. But Blinken also emphasized the importance of maintaining a situation that would preserve the possibility of a future peace process. And in a speech to the UN Security Council a week later, the acting ambassador to the UN, Richard Mills, elaborated on this point. Both sides, Mills said, should avoid unilateral actions that impede efforts to achieve a peace agreement. And he went on to enumerate such actions: annexation of territory, settlement activity, demolitions, as well as incitement of violence and compensation to individuals imprisoned for terrorist activities. Well, that was a very clear message to Israel as well as to the Palestinians. So given the changes in Middle East policy that we can expect from the Biden administration, what policies is Israel likely to adopt? It's hard to say. And there are several reasons why it's hard to say, but in the 1 minute or so that I have, I would emphasize that Israel is about to hold its fourth election in 2 years. And it's not clear at this time who is going to lead the country after that, or what commitments the victor may make to secure support from some of the other contenders. Here is probably the most we can say on that score at the moment. First, Netanyahu is as controversial and polarizing a figure in Israel as Trump was and continues to be in the United States. He has many fervent supporters, but also a growing number of opponents whose opposition is intensifying. The left and the center have almost completely disappeared from Israeli political life. Both of them are very weak, considerably weaker than they have ever been, to my knowledge. Very few Israelis believe that Israel will have a viable negotiating partner with which to participate in a peace process in the foreseeable future, or that territorial withdrawal or demilitarization can guarantee Israel's security. So Israelis are not looking for a leader to steer them into negotiations. With regard to Israeli policies going forward, both domestic and foreign, much is going to hinge on the composition of the government that emerges. Will it be headed by Netanyahu? Will it contain some of Israel's most extreme religious Zionist politicians? Will there be any leftist or centrist politicians in it at all? And if so, will they be in a position to influence policy? If I had to guess, here's my crystal ball, what at this point appears to be most likely is that Netanyahu will manage, as he has so many times in the past, to put together a government. Extreme religious Zionists will be part of that coalition. The pressure on Netanyahu then, both to expand existing settlements and to extend Israeli law to those areas, will be very great. However, to end on a positive note, if the potential rewards for restraint on those two issues are substantial, Netanyahu may be able and willing to resist such pressure. I will turn back the mic, so to speak, to Carl at this time.
Thank you very much, Professor Spechler. Before we move on to Professor Atlas, I meant to mention at the top of the hour that we will be happy to take your questions and comments. If you would avail yourself of the chat function, you can find that at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can leave your questions and comments there, and I will relate them to our panelists after they have had their chance to speak. Professor Atlas.
Thank you, Carl. Thanks for joining us, and hopefully you're hopefully nice and warm and safe at home. First of all, I'd like to make a quick comment of my condolences to Feisal on the death of his sister Zainab. I first met her maybe 15 years ago, actually at Marian University. She came for a conference there, and she was really a terrific lady, and we were Facebook friends, and I really saw the sort of the tragic unfolding of her disease, and but she was truly loved. I mean, just seeing the gushing of respect and love that she received was really impressive, and I know how close you were, and I want to just give you my condolences here. So I will. What I'd like to do is give you my some comments and thoughts on 4 areas. None of us have shared our presentations in advance. There'll be a little bit of overlap, but also a little bit of different interpretation, and I'll focus on a few different things as well. Basically, four general areas I'd like to make some brief comments on. One is my take on the recent evolution of U.S.-Israeli relations and U.S. policy in the Middle East. A quick comment on what have been called the Abraham Accords, which I know Feisal doesn't like that term. I'm literally looking forward to hearing what he calls them, but the normalization of Israel and some of the Arab states. I'd also like to make some comments on rising multipolarity and balance of power politics in the region. And then finally, just a couple brief comments about the coming Israeli elections. So first, on the recent evolution of US policy and the relations with Israel, let me go back a little bit further. I want to just briefly just touch on Obama, Trump, and Biden, because I think it's really important to understand to put Trump in context, we have to put him in the context of Biden. To put Trump in context of Obama. So President Obama entered office naive and overconfident in his powers of persuasion. That would be my assessment. I think he was more of an idealist than a realist on foreign policy, much more focused on American values than necessarily on American interests. He definitely came in wanting to repair the damage that had been caused by the Bush administration and the Iraq War. So similar to Trump coming in wanting to sort of undo some of the things of Obama, Obama came in wanting to undo some of the things of Bush. He started with the Cairo speech in 2009, which was a very powerful speech to the Arab and Muslim world. He visited Arab states in the region. Before he visited Israel, he kind of gave Israel a little bit of a cold shoulder in the beginning. From the very beginning, he publicly demanded that Prime Minister Netanyahu impose a unilateral settlement freeze and openly confronted Netanyahu, which probably was not the most diplomatic thing. These things probably could have been done better behind the scenes, but he was very public about it. And immediately you got this clash of personalities between Netanyahu and Obama. They really genuinely disliked each other, even though U.S.-Israeli policy was very close and U.S. strategic cooperation with Israel was very strong under Obama. The U.S. helped fund the Iron Dome anti-missile program. It was very close strategic and security and intelligence sharing, but the personalities were really clashing. Then we get into the Arab Spring that erupted in 2011. Not only was he Obama upsetting Israel, he was also very much driving the Saudis to distraction. First by the from what the Saudis saw was the abandonment of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt after decades. The Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which not only was upsetting to the Israelis, but also to the Saudis. They saw Iran as a common enemy. And then also the indecisiveness as a Syrian civil war broke out. And Obama did not take the kinds of actions to support the Sunni Arab majority that was being seriously attacked. So the Saudis were also pretty upset with him on that. By the time Obama left office, both Israel and the Saudis were pretty glad to see him go. They had already come closer together, the Israelis and the Saudis, because of their concern over Iran and some of the other issues, and also the uncertainty that was happening in the Arab Spring, because there was so much uncertainty and instability in the region, and they did not trust Obama, either one of them. President Trump comes in, and I would say he had no strategic vision whatsoever, but rather was driven by what he calls America First, and America First isolationism. It was really more America alone. That stressed personal self-interest for Trump, transactionalism, and an obsessive desire to undo or to reverse Obama policies in the Middle East and everywhere around the world. And this was really, if there's any kind of coherent strategic thinking to Trump's foreign policy, it's anti-Obama and anti-free trade. I think those are probably the two kinds of things that really sort of get there. His very first foreign trip was to Saudi Arabia, where he did the famous sword dance and they hung around it with the orb. He openly supported the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in its very, very brutal support of the civil war in Yemen. Tens of thousands of people have been killed there. Yemen is now the single largest humanitarian disaster in the world in terms of conflicts. And then as Trump was leaving office, they designated the Houthis as a terrorist organization. Towards Iran, and the pullout from the Iran deal was also a major linchpin of his foreign policy in the region, as Dina pointed out. I would argue that the Iran deal was actually largely working as it was intended to do. It's legitimately criticized for things that it was not intended to do, but it was actually reducing the enrichment of uranium and along those lines. Trump gave a green light to Israel and to Netanyahu to basically do whatever it wanted. Very close personal relationship with between Trump and Netanyahu, as Dina pointed out. The embassy was moved to Jerusalem. Settlement expansion was supported. The United States, for the first time since 1967, unilaterally recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, reversing bipartisan policies since the Six-Day War. With Iran as a common threat to both Israel and the Saudis, they grew even closer together into a de facto alliance. And I would argue, and I will talk about the Abraham Accords in a minute, but that becomes a major factor in the normalization of Israel within parts of the Arab world. Biden comes in and wants to clean up Trump's mess. His slogan is "America is back," but I would point out that he is not reflexively undoing Trump policies. I think it's actually being very more cautious and careful about that. As Dina pointed out, Secretary Blinken made some pretty clear statements. The United States recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. They're not going to be moving the embassy back out of Jerusalem. It leaves open, of course, the possibility of a second embassy in Jerusalem, of Jerusalem being shared down the line. He didn't say that, but there's no reason why you can't have that. But the U.S. embassy in Jerusalem is pretty much there to stay. But as you know, he did say that the Golan Heights are still up for grabs. There's a difference there between Biden and Trump. The Biden administration did signal they are not planning to quickly rejoin the Iran deal. They want to make some changes in the deal itself. Also, they are not going to immediately lift any sanctions against Iran. So there really is, although there is an interest in getting back in, they're not rushing in. They're being very cautious about how they're going to do it. Biden has also dropped U.S. support, active support for the Saudis in the Yemen civil war. There's still like defensive intelligence being shared, but the U.S. is no longer going to actively support the kinetic activities of the Saudis in the fight. And Biden has removed the Houthis from the terrorist list from the State Department. I would say that Biden is more of a realist than an idealist, unlike Obama. What's really a couple of interesting things about this. One of the questions is, as Dina spent a good deal of time talking about, what is the relationship going to be between Biden and Israel? I'm just going to make one quick observation I think is kind of interesting, and this has become an obsession in Israel. When will Joe Biden call Bibi Netanyahu? He's been president now for almost a month, and he has yet to call the Prime Minister of Israel. This is very unusual. There's a huge debate. There's like a reading of the tea leaves in Israel. Does this mean that it's a snub or whatever? Although some people would point out that Biden also has not called any leaders of any other Middle Eastern country either. Okay, which also signals perhaps that the Middle East is not a major area of interest. But still, given the special relationship between Israel and the United States that has existed for so many presidencies, the fact that he has not actually called Biden has not called Netanyahu is being seen as a kind of an eyebrow raising thing. With Israel elections coming up on March 23rd, there is this cold relationship that seems to be between Biden and Netanyahu. And given the fact that the United States is Israel's only true ally in the region, in the world, I mean, the truly reliable ally, this could have impact on Israeli politics. What's interesting is to what extent will Netanyahu perhaps try and show that he's not beholden to President Biden? On the other hand, it is important to point out just historically, in 1992, when the relationship between the United States and Israel reached pretty much an all-time low between the first President Bush and Prime Minister Shamir, it was so bad. Not only were they not talking to each other, it was over after the end of the Gulf War. It was really, really bad that Yitzhak Rabin actually ran when he was running to lead the Labor Party. One of his major promises during the campaign was he would restore positive relations with the U.S. and also open up a peace process. And that actually led to it was a major factor in him getting elected. If the situation in the next 5 weeks before the election really sours between Biden and Netanyahu, perhaps Yair Lapid, the leader of the major alternative party, might actually try and say, hey, I could have better relations with the United States. We'll sort of see what happens, but that's something sort of to keep in mind. Although Israel and Israeli politics has changed quite a bit since 1992, but still the relationship is something that's pretty important. On to my next major point is about just a couple of observations about the so-called Abraham Accords. As we all know, it's a normalization between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Morocco. These are the first agreements between Israel and Arab countries since 1994 with Jordan. So this is a very big deal. The Trump administration has taken a lot of credit for it. They certainly deserve some credit. It happened on their watch. It is a very big deal. But I would argue that I think that there are a couple of factors that are beyond just Trump and Jared Kushner that really deserve a bit of credit, perhaps most of the credit, for why these normalization agreements took place. One actually is sort of a negative consequence of Trump's foreign policy. I see that as Trump was becoming, really from the beginning, from the time he entered office, he was unpredictable and unreliable. And he made it clear that he was willing to abandon America's traditional allies and abandon America's traditional alliances, including NATO, Japan, South Korea. He would be willing to do that out of pique, or if he didn't get a blatant quid pro quo. Although he pulled out of the Iran deal, and he gave Israel a blank check to pretty much do whatever he wanted. He also signaled that he really wanted to get the United States out of the Middle East. And both from the Israeli perspective and the Saudi perspective, the unreliability of Trump, the fact that Trump really didn't care about the Middle East. Yeah, I'll let you do whatever you want, but I really want to get out of here, right? That sort of made, I think that made things even more uncertain for both for Israel and Iran. I mean, both for Israel and Saudi Arabia and the other Arab Gulf states. Combine that with real or perceived, and both real and perceived, security threats from Iran, and the dynamic of a security dilemma that drove Israel and the Gulf states even closer together than they had been under Obama. And so the unreliability of Trump's foreign policy and the common threat of Iran were mutually reinforcing Israel and the Saudis and the other Gulf states. And I think those were major factors that brought them together. Of course, the Trump administration was willing to say, look, I mean, we support this. We want you guys to do this. Also importantly, significantly, the Trump administration was also willing to grease the wheels by offering F-35s to the United Arab Emirates and by offering Sudan to take it off the terrorism list really in exchange for recognizing Israel. So there was a lot of quid pro quos going on, which is sort of the way Trump thinks. But these kinds of things sort of led to it. I don't think it was necessarily a major, Nobel Prize worthy peace negotiations done by the United States. It really was common interests and reacting to the fact that the United States was sort of abandoning the region in some ways. I would say one more thing about these accords that I think is important, and that is that these accords between Israel and the four Arab states were state-to-state negotiations, and they completely, utterly bypassed the Palestinian issue. None of these Arab state actors made any serious linkage to the Palestinian issue, which is really kind of interesting because that was certainly even Egypt in '79 and Jordan at least had a fig leaf of doing that. But here there wasn't really anything at all. There was an old Arab nationalist slogan, the road to Arab unity goes through Jerusalem, or the road to Arab unity goes through Palestine, meaning that what would bring the entire Arab world together was confronting Israel and liberating Palestine. I would argue that was never really true, but now it's basically a historical trivia question. I think we can put that to rest, basically. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not going to come up and rear its ugly head. I would say that there's always been a legitimacy gap between many Arab regimes and their own citizenry. And if the situation gets tough between Israel and the Palestinians, you may get a popular backlash against some of the regimes that cut the deals with Israel, especially if there's like a third intifada, or if there's a large settlement expansion, a lot of things that basically even further take a two-state solution off the possibilities. Okay, so next, moving on quickly, I also want to make a couple comments about what I see as sort of a rising multipolarity in the Middle East overall, and sort of balance of power politics and recent regional developments. As I said, Obama was fairly, I think, indecisive in his Middle East policy, especially in regard to the Civil War, followed by Trump's America First policy, America First isolationism. Those combined, those basically 12 years of American policy in the region, I think has greatly reduced the influence of the United States in the Middle East. Not only has Russia stepped into the vacuum, but now France is as well. And the traditional regional powers are becoming much more assertive. So who are these major regional powers in the Middle East and also in the Eastern Mediterranean? Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Egypt, and even Greece. Let me just go ahead and show you something real quick here. I want to share my screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Okay, so this is a general map, obviously, of the region. Here we have the Eastern Mediterranean over here. Let me just go ahead and go through this real quick. So in particular, I just want to hit this just for a minute here, because I find this actually pretty interesting. In recent months, there's been a sort of a regional balancing of Turkey as a sort of a rising actor or reasserting its role in the region in maritime disputes over Cyprus, over access to energy sources, things like that. So recently, Egypt and Greece have just conducted joint naval exercises in the Eastern Mediterranean. France is selling jets to Greece to counter Turkey. And note that France, Turkey, and Greece are all NATO members, but there's a competition there. The United Arab Emirates has just entered a joint defense agreement with Cyprus, taking the anti-Turk side with the Cypriots, which are more on the Greek side. Are all these things presenting perhaps an opening for Israel, which has strong relations with Greece, a positive relation with Egypt's government under Sisi, and now an increasingly strong relationship with the United Arab Emirates? These kinds of things we could actually see sort of a balancing that's taking place, kind of old-fashioned 19th century balance of power politics taking place in the Middle East. Note that the United States is nowhere to be found. And what was striking was yesterday in the Jerusalem Post, columnist Herb Kynan, who's been writing for the Jerusalem Post for decades, wrote a column with this headline that really struck me. With the US cold shoulder, should Israel now pivot towards France? And for those of you who know the history of the region, basically France and Israel were very strong allies before the 1967 Six-Day War. France was the primary supplier of Israeli weaponry. In fact, that's what the Israelis used when all their air force were all French aircraft. But since then, it hasn't been the case. The idea that the United States is no longer being seen as the main player, the 800-pound gorilla or whatever, the main player on the block. Other countries are rising to the fore. We're getting old-fashioned balance of power. Russia is still, very much involved in Syria. We have Turkey is reasserting itself. Iran is as well. You have Israel and Saudi Arabia and Gulf states balancing out Turkey. But then United Arab Emirates getting involved in the Eastern Mediterranean with Cyprus. Really, really interesting kinds of things. What's going to happen there? So that's sort of just a general thing. Let me stop sharing. I just wanted to show you that. And you can sort of see, Greece, Turkey. Here's Cyprus over here. You can just sort of see in Egypt, where is all this sort of happening? And then my last point is just want to make a quick observation about the Israeli elections. I completely agree with what Dina said. It's really what's going to happen. We don't know. They're 5 weeks away, March 23rd. Frankly, 5 weeks is a lifetime in politics, even in Israel. This will be the fourth election in 2 years. One of the questions will be, will this actually be a decisive election? Will there be a clear coalition that comes about? And for those of you who don't know, I mean, every Israeli government since the very first one in 1949 has been a coalition. There's never been a party that's received a majority of the vote. It's always been a coalition. So who will lead the coalition? And again, the questions about Bibi, he is as hated as he is loved. What might be the relationship? It'll be interesting to see over the ensuing 5 weeks, what happens with the relationship between Joe Biden and Bibi Netanyahu? And does it get better? Does it continue to be sort of standoffish? How does that play into the election results? And then, of course, the real thing is not going to be just how does Likud under Netanyahu and Yesh Atid under Yair Lapid, which is the second major party, sort of a centrist party, how do they do? But how do all the other parties do? You have to get past the 3.25% threshold to get representation in the Knesset, in the parliament. What parties will actually get there? What kind of coalition will it be? We really don't know. Will there be a large Arab citizen vote like there was previously, or have they become sort of more apathetic, given this is the fourth election? These kinds of things are all up for grabs. So those are pretty much the general kind of opening comments that I had, and I will stand down and pass it on to Feisal.
Well, thank you, Pierre, and thanks to Dina and to you for your kind words about my late sister. I appreciate them very much. So let me try not to tread where I agree with my colleagues so that we can get to questions, but they both, I think between them, went through the list of areas of disagreement between the Biden and Trump administrations, where the Biden administration is likely to keep the policies of the Trump administration in place and where they're likely not to. And I agree with that list, including the embassy in Jerusalem. The observation that I would make is that the move of the US embassy to Jerusalem was always sort of the card that the United States held closest to its vest. It was called in the State Department famously the crown jewels. And the idea was that, yes, it would eventually happen, but that the United States would extract something from Israel in exchange. And of course, Trump, the self-described greatest deal maker probably in the history of the world, gives it away to Israel and requires no quid pro quo from the Israelis whatsoever. And that is, as my colleagues have not quite that pithily put it, but have, I think, demonstrated that that more or less was the Trump administration's approach to Israel. And it isn't, and I recognize that when Dina said that, well, Israel wanted this and Israel got that, of course, she's correct insofar as this was the government of the state of Israel, and therefore the entity that sets policy for the state of Israel, to which the administration was responding. But let's be clear that in the context of the other aspect that my colleagues have talked about which I have very little to say, and that is the elections that are going to occur in the state of Israel. That government constitutes a very much, very far to the right of the Israeli spectrum. And it was those sort of those policies, which were the policies of the state of Israel, to which the United States acceded in the Trump administration, again, without having received any quid pro quo in exchange for adopting that hard, the sort of Israeli hard right line. That said, my objection to the Abraham Accords is to the names, because it suggests that this was some struggle between, the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael, as if it were some religious war, some sort of, to use the language, some Jewish-Muslim crusade. And so that's my objection to it, is that the name, I think, is actually harmful to the, so I don't really, I mean, you can call it, Henry if you want to, I don't care, but that particular naming of it, I think makes sort of elevates the conflict into an interreligious conflict, and I think that is my objection to the name. But let's be clear. I agree with Pierre. Whatever the importance of the agreements, and Pierre, at one point, if you'll forgive me, you misspoke. You said Saudi Arabia was one of the countries, unless I misheard you. Of course, it's Sudan, which you then went back to and said Sudan later, but I just want to make that very clear, if you'll forgive me. So it's the Bahrain, UAE, Sudan, and Morocco. And normalization is the correct term. They've been called peace accords. Of course, these are four countries that have never actually fired a shot at one another. So so peace, I think, would have been a misnomer. A normalization accord, I think, is the correct name. In respect to Bahrain and the UAE, it is a formal acknowledgement, a public, I should say, acknowledgement of really a de facto strategic alliance with Israel, which had been in place for some time. And it isn't only because of the Iran deal that may have had some sort of public component of bringing the two sides or the various parties together, but there's actually been a number of areas of cooperation, including in terms of in the UAE in particular, in internal security. And reliance, for instance, on Israeli technology and work and the purchase of equipment and so on from Israeli companies. That's been going on for a long time. But the Iran situation sort of made it public. I do think it's deeply problematic for American policy, not only in the Middle East, but worldwide, that a condition for Sudan getting off the state sponsor of terrorism list was that it would make that it would normalize relations with Israel. I think that goes to that puts into question the policy of the United States naming state sponsors of terror, and makes it apparent that considerations other than the fact of a state being a state sponsor of terror is what gets you on or off that list. And I think that's deeply problematic from the broader perspective of American policy. But as Pierre, I think, accurately said, the Trump administration was involved in these sort of quid pro quos, and you weren't going to get off. And the mere fact that you were not a state sponsor of terror, as indeed Sudan has not been, at least since the coup, that's not enough to get you off the state sponsor of terror list. But there you have it. And of course, Morocco has had open relations with Israel for a very long time. I mean, there's been no mystery about any of that. So I'm going to take a sort of narrower look at the issues. And I want to start at least let me talk about one thing that my colleagues didn't talk about, and that is an event which is now maybe a week or so old, and that is the announcement by the International Criminal Court that it will accept, that it accepts, the pretrial chamber has accepted a prosecutor's recommendation for an investigation into alleged war crimes and presumably, well, let me be more general, and that is to say that for crimes that are within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. One of the unusual things about the so-called Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, in distinction to any other treaty that I'm aware of, is that the ICC is the only treaty which can apply against a state non-party if the alleged crime occurs on the territory of a state party. And while the United States and Israel do not recognize that Palestine is a state, the General Assembly does, and the Secretariat, the Secretary General, accepted the deposit of ratification of the Rome Statute by the Palestinians, by the state of Palestine. And that means that from the date of the deposit of the ratification, or at least the date of acceptance of the ratification to the present, the ICC would have jurisdiction to investigate allegations of crimes. Now that's an interesting thing. I don't know, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu called the act anti-Semitic and politically motivated and all of that. I think it's probably more accurate to say that the court's assessment is likely to be motivated by law rather than by a political consideration of the issues. But it's just sort of hanging out there, and it'll be interesting to see, because the ICC will, if it issues any indictments, is not going to issue indictments of low-level perpetrators. It will issue indictments only of higher level alleged perpetrators. The interesting thing about it is that, as a rule, the ICC, once it has jurisdiction over a matter, is not limited to looking at one party or the other, but it has jurisdiction over a matter, the situation in fill in the blank, and so can actually issue indictments on either side of a conflict. But that's sort of sitting out there, and it may have some effect, some influence. Maybe it'll have some influence on the election in Israel, perhaps not. But in any event, I think it's an interesting development nonetheless. Now, I agree with Dina that the Middle East is, other than the Iran nuclear agreement, is not going to be a priority for the Biden administration. But I think it is more likely that the Europeans will want the European allies of the United States will want a lowering of the tensions in the Middle East. It's closer to home. It is a part of the world that the European powers have had something to say about for a very long time. And Pierre did a really nice job of talking about the sort of balancing that is going on. I did, by the way, if I may drop a footnote, he talked about the sort of power balance that we saw in Europe, in the 19th century, that sort of multipolarity, balancing that's going on. I couldn't help thinking when you were saying that, Pierre, that all of that ended in the First World War. So I hope we have a better outcome than that. So maybe the Europeans aren't really that good at it after all, although they kept the peace for a century, but still. So hopefully we're not headed in that direction. But there are a number of countries that are re-engaged or engaged, some appearing to punch above their weight, like the UAE and Bahrain, UAE in particular, and Turkey, which has seemingly utterly abandoned its Kemalist slogan of peace at home, peace abroad. It's problems at home and more problems abroad seems to be the Erdogan's motto, completely reversing the Kemalist motto. And that all is cause for concern. But hopefully the Europeans, I have hopes that the Europeans will nudge the Biden administration into a greater engagement in the Middle East. Whether they're successful at that or not, they never disengaged to the extent that Trump did, in fact, disengage from trying to make a sort of an accommodation of the competing sides between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Europeans in general have not disengaged. And it's conceivable that they might have the, and I remember when I was at the Middle East session of Davos once in Jordan, the Dead Sea, some years ago, when Biden at the time was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He was introduced as the senator from Europe. He was speaking on the same panel as the then German foreign minister. This was in 2003. I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was Joschka Fischer. So he is, I think, more attuned to the Europeans, certainly, than the Trump administration has been, and may very well re-engage if he is pushed to do so, as I think he will be by the Europeans. By the way, on the issue of his not having spoken to Middle Eastern leaders so far, it would be interesting to know when, after November the 7th, Netanyahu and the other leaders in the Middle East called Biden. Because Biden would know very much the rule of sort of international diplomacy about reciprocity. I'm just curious if he's waiting for the same number of days before he reaches out to them. We'll see. Although I think the King of Jordan was one of the first Middle East leaders to have reached out to Biden after the election. So I want to, I know I've had some general comments. Let me sort of come to one of two topics that I want to talk about before I turn this back over to Carl. And that's if the Israelis are about to have their, I think Dina said, fourth election in 2 years, which is, I think, what I remember as well. The Palestinians are about to have their first elections in 15 years, 16 actually. The last parliamentary elections were in 2006 amongst the Palestinians. The last presidential election was in 2005 when President Abbas was elected to a 4-year term. He's still there as president. So we expect elections in Palestine to take place in May for parliament. I think it's the 22nd of May, and on the 31st of July for the presidency. the state of the Israeli elections is sort of probity itself, and so compared, I think, to the chaos that is a characteristic of what is happening in Palestine. The Palestinians are deeply divided. The polls, if polls are meaningful in Gaza and the West Bank, show that Hamas is likely to do about if the polls remain as they are between now and July, that Hamas and the PLO, Hamas controlling Gaza currently, the PLO controlling the West Bank to the extent either of them controls either, which is not much. The polls indicate for parliamentary elections, the polls indicate that a fairly even split between the two is somewhere in the mid-30s between them. Hamas is actually 7 points ahead, according to these same polls in the presidential elections. Now, this is sort of interesting because if past is prologue, we know that when the Palestinians have been divided, and when you had divided government in Gaza and the West Bank, Prime Minister Netanyahu refused to deal with the Palestinians, refused to entertain negotiations on a theory while the Palestinians are divided. So when they united, Prime Minister Netanyahu said he would refuse to negotiate because, after all, Hamas is a terrorist organization and he would not negotiate with a government that included them. So there's always a reason not to negotiate. And I know that it is fairly common, particularly in Western media, to say there is no Palestinian partner in the peace negotiations. That may or may not be true, but I would also argue that there actually is not an Israeli partner either. And I'll come back to that point very briefly before I end. If the elections, and it is by no means certain that the elections will take place, but they are scheduled. If the elections take place, and it isn't clear yet whether the current president, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, will be a candidate. He is, after all, 85 years old. He at one point threatened to resign and was actually cajoled into remaining. Now, whether it took a lot of cajoling or whether that was all for show and for publicity, who knows, but he is 85 years old and has been, let's face it, fairly ineffectual for whatever reason. So whether a new leadership is likely to emerge remains to be seen. Where that new leadership would come from on the Palestinian side is not clear, certainly not to me. And so just as the Israelis have sort of been stuck in a rut for well over a decade of it's Netanyahu versus somebody else, I think the Palestinians very much are in the same rut. There is no obvious, to me, successor to Abbas. The idea that he will run again and be somehow elected again, assuming he wins, is, at his age and given his record, and given the fact that I think he's just tired, and it's time for new blood, but it isn't obvious where that new blood would come from. And I think that I really have very little basis for optimism that we get off the dime. I do think that while the Trump administration was never in a position, no American administration is in a position unilaterally to declare what is and is not consistent with international law. Nonetheless, the United States, of course, is a hugely important player in the region, or has been. And I think that if you are interested in a two-state solution, I do think that the Trump administration did real harm, and I think long-lasting harm to, if not permanent damage to the two-state solution, which, after all, Edward Said said, I think, in 2002 was dead by then. That's 18 years ago. So maybe they didn't do harm after all. They just sort of kept prodding or beating a dead horse. If that's the point of view, then that's the point of view. but I do think that it is a harder place to get to now after 4 years of the Trump administration than it was before. So there is one thing, and I mention this every time I speak on this topic. I think this is the third time, if I remember correctly, that this panel has reconvened with my distinguished colleagues. So let me, if you'll forgive me, I'm gonna, just in case there's anybody here who wasn't here the other 2 times, let me show this slide, which I always show when I speak about this issue. If I can get under here to sort of, there we go. So if I can make it from the current slide. So this is, now I've got this slide maybe a year or 2 ago now, maybe about 2 years ago, I think I found it. And it is from Anarwa is the source, but you can see that prior to 2014, their actual numbers. Beyond that, I believe they are projected numbers. And the point is, and I always get to this sort of bottom line, and what it is a slide of starting in 1922, and these numbers are actual, then 2014 and high and above, actually maybe up to 2014, actually, that they're actual numbers. But in any event, the projection is, I'm not sure about that. It may be just to 2000. So this slide may be older than I think. But the point is that at some point, and according to these numbers, to this slide, in about 15 years, if you look at the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, so you look at the state of Israel proper, which you'll remember it has 22% of Israeli citizens are Arab. So they're Muslim or Christian citizens of the state of Israel. That is sort of pre-1967 Israel. But if you look at the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, in about 15 years plus or minus, you start to get, because of birth rates, a higher birth rate, a higher population of Muslims than of Jews. Unfortunately, as you can also see, there's been a general de-Christianization of the Middle East generally, and that includes in Israel and the Palestinian territories, as well as the Arab states. And that becomes then a sort of, I think, a question then for the Israelis as to what incentives it seems to me the Israelis have to try to make some settlement that is amenable to the Palestinians, as opposed to what the Trump administration attempted to do, which was to sort of impose really a settlement that I don't think any Palestinian authority could have accepted because of the sort of Bantustans that it created, with the Palestinians having really no sovereignty, none of the indicia of sovereignty, and really giving the Palestinians no particular incentive. Even the economic aspect of the agreement that that Kushner and Trump proposed, no one came up. It was clear Trump wasn't going to pay for it, and none of the states in the region or elsewhere came up with any sort of incentive for the Palestinians. So it was really an illusory proposal, designed more or less to give the Israelis what they want, at least that the Israeli government of the day, what it wanted. And in particular, that included the annexation of the Jordan Valley, which the two contenders in the last election, Gantz and Netanyahu, both agreed would be annexed by the Israelis. So the incentives, it seems to me, for the Palestinians are diminishing. And while I think, and I've said this before, I think the Israelis think they can maintain the status quo ad infinitum, and maybe they can. It seems to me if these demographics are remotely correct, that they have a demographic problem that they have to contend with that I don't see a rational way of dealing with. I'll end on this. I'm particularly pessimistic. I don't think any movement, I agree with my colleagues who've said that I don't think there's going to be any likely movement in the next 4 years, or maybe the 4 years after that, or the 4 years after that. And I think things just keep going as they are, which strikes me as an outside observer as rather an unsatisfactory state of affairs, but I don't see things improving. And with that, I'm sorry, I think I went over my time, but I'll stop talking now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Feisal. Thanks to Pierre and Dina as well. You've helped us begin to sort out a complicated set of intertwined issues. We do have a few questions, so I will relay them. Let's begin with this one. If Israel feels the US will be less interested in the region generally and less supportive of Israeli foreign policy specifically, where are they likely to look for support? Are they already improving relations with Russia, China, or others? And there's an associated question, more succinct. Is Russia an enemy or an ally of Israel? Please.
Okay, well, I'll start off just discussion. That's one of the reasons, that concern about the possible unreliability of the United States is indeed one of the reasons why these normalization accords are so important to Israel. I mean, I think I would like to emphasize that in addition to the role of the Trump administration, the threat from Iran is really what has driven those accords up to now. And is going to continue to drive those accords for some time to come. I would also say economic possibilities, both Israel and on the one hand, and Bahrain and UAE see enormous benefits from development of trade and investment. But for the future, so first of all, Israel would like very, very much to extend those accords to Saudi Arabia. I don't think that's going to happen while the king is still alive and functioning, because he's opposed that adamantly. But we don't know how long that's going to last. And I think that the Crown Prince is very interested in reaching an accord with Israel. So there's no substitute for the United States for Israel. Absolutely no substitute. Every Israeli acknowledges that. And Israel will do whatever it can to maintain that relationship, even making distasteful compromises sometimes in order to do that. But the question was, are there other allies? So I think that Israel is looking to the day when states like Bahrain and UAE, and most importantly, Saudi Arabia, possibly also Oman, are trusted partners in a security relationship that can help to strengthen the state of Israel. I'll go on beyond that and say, I think just as we have seen Saudi Arabia attempt to play a constructive role in promotion of the peace process, I think that possibly the wealthy Gulf states can play something of a positive and mediating role between Israel and Palestinians. And it's terribly important for trust to be developed and established between Israel and those states for that mediating role to become possible. But I wouldn't rule that out for the future as a future development. Now, the countries of China and Russia have also been mentioned. So they're not allies, but they're not enemies. So Israel has excellent relations with both of them. And in fact, the Chinese are playing an ever-growing role in the Israeli economy, acquiring all kinds of firms, startups, tech companies, even rights in the ports of Haifa and Ashdod. And so far, that actually was an issue with the Trump administration because Israel has not really shared the fear about a growing Chinese role in the world that the Trump administration had. And that doesn't make China a reliable friend, even partner of Israel, but it's certainly not an enemy. The relationship is excellent. And likewise, almost the same thing can be said of Russia, but for different reasons. The potential for investment in the Israeli economy is far less, if it's existent at all, for Russia. But on the other hand, what has greased that relationship for a long time is the number of Russians who emigrated to Israel. And both countries want to maintain a good relationship. Those Russians in Israel are an important factor in helping to do that. But also, Israel has cooperated with Russia, certainly in the trade realm. And there is an interesting relationship growing now. I don't want to, it's a little premature to put too much stake on it, but on the Golan. So both Russia and Syria have been increasingly interested in diminishing an Iranian presence in the Golan, let alone the Iranian militias, which are troublemakers. And there have been quiet talks in Cyprus and elsewhere among Russia and Syria and Israel about the future of the Golan, but more importantly about the future of Syria. So Russia has helped to and participated in facilitating those talks. So again, it's an excellent relationship with Russia. There's no particular tension there. But on the other hand, Russia is not going to be a source of security for for Israel in the foreseeable future. So in the end, we're back to the United States, but I think the major Gulf states can be other actors in expanding Israel's, shall we say, partnership horizons in the world and in the Middle East in particular.
May I jump in very quickly on the issue of Iran and the threat that it poses? Because this is one area where I don't agree with Dina. I've never seen the Iranian nuclear program as a threat to Israel. I think it has always been for two reasons. One is that Israel has its own credible deterrent. And second, it would certainly be under the American nuclear umbrella. And the United States has a more than credible deterrent vis-a-vis any reasonably, foreseeable Iranian nuclear program. I've always thought that the Iranians looked at North Korea and learned a lesson that if you have nuclear weapons, you gain security for regime security. I've never seen however undesirable, and please don't get me wrong, I am as loath to see Iran nuclear armed as anybody else on this or any other Zoom call. But not because it's a threat to Israel. I've never thought that. I think it is much more likely for regime security and a calculation that the Iranians, which I think Trump made worse by the withdrawal from the JCPOA, keep in mind, Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been, calling for the bombardment of Iran for a decade or thereabouts, and for a decade has been telling us that Iran is a year away from making a nuclear weapon. So I've always thought, again, that the Iranian nuclear program, to the extent it was likely to result in them having a nuclear weapon, was more about regime survival than anything else. And I think that just to comment on what Dina just said about the Golan Heights in Syria, I think the Syrian regime has, prior to the civil war in Syria, I think were also much more concerned about regime survival than they were about getting the Golan Heights back. Now, of course, it would be that in spades, I think. But anyway, I just wanted to comment on those 2 points.
So I'd like to follow up also a couple things on Iran. I tend to agree with Feisal about there's a rational logic or rational choice for why Iran would want to have nuclear weapons, especially or to develop a nuclear program. It's unclear whether they actually want to have weapons or not, but have the ability to get there. at one point, not that long ago, there were 150,000 American combat troops on 2 Iranian borders, in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and there was an interest in the deterrence effort of that. I think what poses a greater threat to Israel is not the potential possibility down the line of acquiring nuclear weapons, but it's their ballistic missiles and their support for Hezbollah. And Iran is really the only serious military threat to Israel in the region. And it's the only country in the region that actually talks about being a military strategic threat to Israel. So I think it has to be taken seriously in that sense, whether or not they get nukes or not. I'd like to sort of jump in also on the thing about Israel and allies in other countries. One thing I neglected to mention in my remarks with the Israel-UAE relationship is United Arab Emirates is going to start shipping oil to Israel. And they're going to be going into Eilat. They're going to be shipping it in tankers, and then Israel's going to build a pipeline from there to take it further up into Israel. So they're going to be supplying oil to Israel. This is going to be the first time, possibly, I can't remember when was the last time an Arab state was actually supplying oil to Israel, because before the Iranian Revolution, the major supplier for oil to Israel was the Shah's Iran. So I'm not even sure if there's ever been a time when an Arab state was actually supplying oil to Israel before. But this is going to be, that's a pretty big deal. Beyond that, the normalization process is going to build more normalization. It's going to build off of itself as a positive feedback loop. And I think that the more Israel is accepted into the Arab world, the more other countries are going to be willing to deal with Israel. And it's going to give them like sort of like a stamp of approval in some ways. But I would add, in addition to what the countries that Dina talked about, India is another country that Israel has very strong ties with. And India, of course, is the world's largest democracy, very high tech, strong military. India and Israel have similar mutual concerns with Pakistan as a nuclear powered state that also takes a verbally hostile position against Israel. Netanyahu and Modi have a very strong personal relationship. They get along very well. The same thing, and Netanyahu and Putin actually get along. I would say the one thing that's interesting is that the relationship between the U.S. and Israel is very deep. It's a cultural relationship, not just because of American Jews, but also Christian Zionists. And a lot of Americans just have a natural kind of affinity for Israel, seeing it as a more Western type country, democracy and all that. I don't think you have a very deep affinity among Russian people for Israel, or among people of maybe India perhaps, but a lot of the other countries, I don't think you're going to have that. I think it's more leader to leader strategic relationships that Israel is building, which is actually in its interest. But in terms of a kind of deep cultural ties, where people who are not even Jewish have a strong affinity for Israel, that's really only the United States. You're not going to find that elsewhere. And that's something that also makes it the American relationship kind of irreplaceable. But given the balance of power, given the multipolarity of the world, and also the United States is no longer the only economic player, let alone the only strategic player, there is a lot of expansion. And again, as Israel becomes less of a pariah in the Arab world, it's going to be a lot easier for other countries outside the Arab world to go ahead and have relationships with Israel. And the thriving relationships they have today, economically, politically, militarily, was not even really imaginable 10 or 15 years ago. And I think that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind. And then, of course, there always is France. Who knows? Maybe they will reach out to France again.
Not reliable.
Thank you. Here's one from Pete Lenzen. It's a rather specific question. So if I may, Pete, I'm going to take the liberty to generalize it. The question is the Middle East in better shape in terms of peace, political stability, and economic stability from the transfer of the embassy to Jerusalem? But I think given what the goal of the panel was today, I'd like to know, is Israel and the Middle East or the Middle East in better shape in terms of peace, political, and economic stability after 4 years of Donald Trump, or not?
I would say no. I don't even believe, frankly, I think that kind of going off of what Feisal was saying about the demographic trends and other things, I don't think it's in Israel's best interest to be moving in the direction of a one-state solution. So even a lot of the pro-Israel policies of Trump that people thought were pro-Israel, I think down the line actually will undermine Israel's long-term security, both demographically and politically. I don't think anywhere else really in the region is much better off either. I will say again, I think the normalization is very important, but I really do give credence much more to the common security threats and fears of Iran than Trump. So I wouldn't say that that's really the result of Trump's actions. But I think overall, I don't see the region as being better off now than it was 4 years ago. I think there's more instability and less security. That would be my take.
So I would say I would agree with Pierre that I don't think things are better as a result of Trump. I think, on the other hand, I'm not sure that anyone in Washington could have done a whole lot to put the Middle East in a better position. The woes of the Middle East are manifold, and I'm not sure there's something that Washington could have addressed or that any American president would have been willing to address. So is a two-state solution farther off as a result of Trump policies? Possibly, but I'm also in agreement with the other part of Faisal's comments, which is that the two-state solution has been very problematic and out of reach for a very, very long time, difficult to accomplish. And that's why, insofar as I want to look for hope, I actually do look to the Gulf states as possibly playing a positive role in bringing Israelis and Palestinians together. I think they want to do that. Perhaps the incentive is less these days than it has been in the past, a greater willingness simply to ignore the state of Israeli-Palestinian affairs. But I think that they can play a positive role, but I think that's in the distant future. Will there be some point at which some of the demographic realities that Feisal pointed to kind of penetrate into the Israeli consciousness? Possibly, but in order for those realities to have a positive effect, there has to be a sense that that there's some solution which really will assure Israel of security, and simply holding up the demographic threat and the dangers that it poses, I don't think is going to be enough. I guess that's my view.
Well, on that point, I think the point I'm making is that it is that sense, Pierre's point earlier, that there's a sense of Israel as a fellow philosophical traveler, as a democracy in the Middle East, as an elective democracy in a region which is plagued by too many tyrants, I think is not incidental to that depth of support that it has. So it's not that the population of the Palestinians is going to represent an existential threat to the state of Israel somehow, in terms of state security, but that as that population gets larger and larger, and to the extent that Israel is seen as taking harsher and harsher measures against that population, I think, and I could be wrong about this, but I think it puts into the question that sort of, so that sort of liberal fellow traveler or whatever, and I'm sorry I'm not saying it well, I hope my point's clear. That, I think, is the threat to Israel. Not that if you have, Palestinians around, somehow they're a threat to Israel. It's that as the population grows, and as Israel continues, as it does through creeping annexations, 2,000 units here, 1,000 units here, 500 units there, there's a sense of Israel becoming increasingly less and more illiberal. And that, I think, is a danger that the Israeli political class needs to keep in mind vis-a-vis American support, because I think it has very much benefited by gaining the support of the United States. And I agree with my colleagues that the United States really is the only truly reliable guarantor of Israeli security, and has been for a very long time. That's the danger that I see to Israel, not some kind of, security threat or whatever, or that there's going to be open rebellion or hostile or whatever it is, much less anything else. So as to the question, I guess the question that Carl asked, I agree with my colleagues, and in the interest of maybe getting another question or two, I won't say more than that about that. I think their analysis is correct, both Dina and Pierre, that the only thing I would add is this. The normalization, the sort of the comment I would make about normalization is that the normalization has been on the table from the Arab side since 2002. Right, with a Saudi peace plan. There was a condition attached to it, which is let's solve the underlying problem. And so the only observation I would make in light of this normalization is that to the extent that the Arabs have indeed, as I think Pierre said, sort of the Arab side, the 4 Arab states, and really Saudi Arabia too, except in addition to the king, they're also domestic. There's a domestic constituency other than the king. That is the population of Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has a real population, unlike Bahrain and the Emirates, I mean, in terms of numbers. And the crown prince has to be, he can't get too far out in front of the parade. He's not that solidly ensconced yet that he can ignore public opinion in Saudi Arabia. But to the extent that the Arabs have normalized without the condition, it seems to me Israel has fewer, not more, incentives to deliver a solution with the Palestinians, or to find a solution with the Palestinians. As the kind of normalization that's coming that Pierre talked about, those incentives go down, and so we're left in the state of play that we're in. And so, yes, Israel got what it could not have dreamed of perhaps 10 years ago, but it makes resolving the underlying situation, I think, more difficult. And that again sort of adds to my pessimism as to where we're headed.
Yeah.
Please, Dina.
I just want to make a comment about the demographics and Israeli policy, where we're beginning to see a very interesting consequence is in this election campaign in particular, is appeal to the Arab vote. So the joint list, which consisted of 4 Arab parties, is beginning to disintegrate because there are all kinds of disagreements. Very different parties composed that list. And now, and I've also mentioned before that there's really no center left. There is this blue and white party, but it's lost tremendous prestige. Someone mentioned Yesh Atid, but that's pretty far on the right, actually. But what we've been seeing is right-wing politicians, which are almost all there are, rushing to Arab areas within Israel and making promises and talking about road building and housing construction, and investment in water resources. Now, of course, this may simply fizzle after the election when the vote is no longer needed. But we also saw this in the last election where the joint list did extraordinarily well, that the larger the Arab population within Israel, the more that the Arab vote will be part of a kind of mainstream vote. And I do see a day when there will be Arab members of a coalition government. I don't think we're there yet, but I do see a day. And regardless of what goes on with regard to peace with territories, I think this is a very interesting development within Israel in terms of the role of Israeli Arabs in the Israeli political mainstream.
Well, thank you. We have come to the end of our time, so just 2 dates to look forward to in the short term. March 23rd, I believe, is the date of the Israeli elections, and May 22nd is currently the scheduled date for the Palestinian elections. So on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Middle East, my thanks to Ambassador Istrabadi, Professor Atlas, and Professor Spechler. And thanks to all of you for coming out on such a cold and wintry night, braving the weather to make it to this Zoom meeting. Thank you very much and have a great evening.
Okay.